Welcome to History Forum. I'm your host, Dr. Jacob Roerum. In this program, we're featuring Ceniza Choy, author of Asian American Histories of the United States. Despite nearly 200 years of Asian history in the United States, there continues to be little understanding of Asian American history. Her book includes diverse voices of immigrants, refugees, US-born Asian Americans, multiracial Americans, and workers from across many different industries. We are glad to welcome her to History Forum. For over 20 years, History Forum has brought the best U.S. history scholars to St. Paul to share award-winning books and cutting-edge historical research. Each talk may illuminate a history you've never heard before, or bring a new perspective on a familiar topic. But regardless, each program will give you a deeper and more complex understanding of the past and your relationship to it. Enjoy the program.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I appreciate it so much because I spent 6 years here as an assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota from 1998 to 2004 before coming to Berkeley, and my 2 children were born here. So it means so much. These were really formative years. I am so grateful to the Department of American Studies, where I had incredible historians, U.S. historians like Elaine Tyler May and Brenda Child, who were terrific mentors and colleagues. And at that point in time, I was also involved in what was then called the Asian American Studies Initiative at the University of Minnesota, and want to give a special shout out to one of my mentors and dear colleague and friend, Professor Josephine Lee. But also my colleague, Professor Rich Lee. He and I also share an interest in Asian American adoption studies. So this means a great deal. Thanks so much. I'm going to begin with this, just the title slide. I want to point out that if you would like to connect with me on social media, I'm on LinkedIn, and it's just my full name, Ceniza Choy is the handle. And if there's anything you wanted to say or ask me that you didn't get a chance to during the Q&A or during the book signing, you're welcome to contact me via email, ceniza@berkeley.edu. Okay, I want to begin talking about this book and Beacon Press. It was published by Beacon Press, which is a long-standing independent nonprofit publisher, and it publishes some of the most important voices in our lifetimes, and so it's such an honor to be a part of this press. Some of the work they've published include works by Martin Luther King Jr. and Viktor Frankl and James Baldwin. And the editor I work with, Gayatri Patnaik, who's now the publisher of Beacon Press, she created this revisioning history book series. And it is, as I note here, it consists of accessibly written books by scholars that reconstruct and reinterpret U.S. history from diverse perspectives. So my book, I believe, is the 7th in this series, which includes books including a queer history of the United States, a disability history of the United States, a Black women's history of the United States, and one of their most well-known titles is by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. But I also want to emphasize in this description here the word accessibly, the words accessibly written. They are really written for the broadest audience possible. And even though there is parts of the writing that are very scholarly, I mean, I am a trained historian and a scholar, but I really wrote it for so many people to read who can't be in my classroom, who may not major in or minor in Asian American studies or ethnic studies. So I just want to emphasize that. And so far the feedback that I've been receiving regarding the accessibly written nature of the book has been, for the most part, quite positive. And so it's been used even in some high schools as well as community colleges and universities. It's been used by different organizations. So I'm very excited about that. And there is a young adult version that's going to be forthcoming, that's being adapted by poet and educator Sung Yen Shin, who's from here, who's based here, and Professor Sarah Park-Dallin. I wanted to point out a couple of things about the cover. That's important. One has to do with the title and the emphasis on histories, the plural. Asian America is such a large and diverse group. It is the largest racial and fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the United States. At this point, consists of a population that's over 24 million people that are coming from many major countries representing the Indian subcontinent, East Asia, as well as Southeast Asia. And so we're getting to this point where it is quite challenging for that umbrella identity category of Asian America to encompass all of our experiences. And I wanted to acknowledge this with the plurality of histories. I also wanted to point out the cover, which was beautifully designed by Carol Chu, not by me. The one thing I asked in this cover was that the color scheme be vibrant and joyful. And I think she did an amazing, beautiful job doing that. This book is very much an overview of Asian American history, almost 200 years of it. And it was written, however, primarily during the years of our COVID-19 pandemic. So even though it's a reflection of my over 25 years now of research, teaching, and service in Asian American studies, it was written during those years. And those were very difficult years for our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities who were dealing with dual existential crisis. On the one hand, this deadly disease, and then accompanying that, the surge in anti-Asian violence that derived from medical racism and medical scapegoating of our communities. So I really wanted the color scheme to also remind us that these are communities that are dynamic and alive, and that joy and celebration are also major themes in our experiences. Even though there's an emphasis on the plural and the differences within Asian America, there are major historical themes that bring these very diverse communities together. And these are the three that I emphasize in the book: violence, erasure, and resistance. And each of these words and the themes are also in some ways like umbrella themes. They're big ideas, and they actually encompass quite a bit of complexity and nuance. So violence, in the most straightforward way, I was referring to the anti-Asian violence that was coronavirus related, but there has been an over 150-year history of anti-Asian violence. And oftentimes when we hear about the violence, it's often the most egregious cases in the current day, especially related to mass murder or mass shooting. But violence in the book plays out in so many different ways. In addition to those things, it's also a violence about bullying, that involves bullying, that involves vandalism, that involves expulsion and arson, among other things. Erasure. Some of the feedback I've received is that this is one of the most interesting, some readers have felt, as a theme. And by erasure, I am talking about the not knowing of Asian American histories and how that not knowing comes from different kinds of erasure. So during World War II, when approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forcibly evacuated and interned in remote areas in a number of states, Dorothea Lange, the famous documentary photographer, was charged by the War Relocation Authority to take photos of this experience and phenomenon. And her photos depicted Japanese Americans and the incredible tragedy of this, that 2/3 of them were US born and citizens, and yet they were forcibly evacuated and incarcerated without due process. And in presenting their humanity and the tragedy of this, her photographs were then impounded. They were locked away in an archive, not to be seen for many decades. And that's a form of erasure of that experience. What might have been had we been able to see those images at the time. Another kind of erasure has to do with something that I really engaged, confronted, and really learned from my students and colleagues and the communities here in Minnesota, which is how integral the histories of our Southeast Asian American refugee and immigrant communities are. And this year we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War, and the refugee resettlement, the historic refugee resettlement of so many Vietnamese, Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian refugees in various parts throughout the United States, but such an important community here in Minnesota. And yet, even though we might be more familiar, of course, with the Vietnam War, we often are less familiar about the refugee experiences of Southeast Asian Americans and beyond the Vietnamese refugee experience, referring to Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodia. And this has to do with the way secrecy was part of this experience, and the labeling of the Vietnam War and our role in it in Laos as a secret war, as it was called, the secret recruitment of Hmong Hill tribesmen by the CIA to ally with US-backed forces during this time. That secrecy has also contributed to erasure of these experiences and our not knowing. And finally, resistance. And by resistance, I am referring to Asian American resistance to what has been omitted, to say that we too are human beings and that we too have contributed to US history, and that this needs to be acknowledged. The way I write in this book is quite different from my other books. So the first thing I want to emphasize is the different kind of structure. So unlike most history books, including my first two books, Asian American Histories of the United States features a nonlinear, or what some readers have called a backwards chronology. And each chapter features an origin year in Asian American histories, but it begins in the year 2020, and it concludes with the year 1869. And then the writing. I write differently in this book. I write in the first person and second person points of view, in addition to the more traditional third person point of view that historians traditionally write in. And I do this in order to share my own, my family's experiences, and also to cultivate, I think, one of the most important values of history learning, which is empathy. So, are you ready to kind of explore the various chapters with me? Let me begin with the year 2020. So this particular origin year is important because it's the year that the World Health Organization declared that COVID-19 was a pandemic. And even though we were initially here in the United States, there were still those feelings of US exceptionalism until we realized we had become, had moved away like from other parts of the world, where of course major outbreaks in China, but Italy, South Korea, and then we realized that the United States was also becoming an epicenter of disease. And this was accompanied by this surge in anti-Asian violence in the United States. And we know this because of the creation of a nonprofit organization that initially started as a reporting center called Stop AAPI Hate. Stop AAPI Hate was founded by educators and community organizers and activists who are in Asian American organizations. Russell Jung, Ceniza Choy, and Manjusha Kulkarni. And when the state of California, all of them are based in California, when the state of California said that they couldn't create a reporting center, the three of them took it upon themselves to create it. And it was Stop AAPI Hate. It was a self-reporting center, and if you had experienced or if you had observed an incident of anti-Asian hate, you could report it, and you could report it in a number of languages. So this is a screenshot from the website when it was a reporting center, and you could select your language in order to report it. And this was so important because today we now know that this was part of the experience, that even though Asian Americans are popularly stereotyped as model minorities, that in 2020, 2021, 2022, that these diverse communities could be racialized as a virus and as disease carriers. Now, for Asian American historians, and if you study Asian American history, as I point out in this chapter, what you learn is that this is not new. So part of what is contributing to this surge is not solely the declaration of COVID-19 as a pandemic, but actually a historical pattern of medical scapegoating. And so when I was talking with many different journalists during this time, and they were asking me, why is this happening? I would point to this historical pattern that begins in the second half of the 19th century with the Chinese being blamed for outbreaks of smallpox and cholera, or pioneering Japanese immigrants for typhoid fever, or early waves of South Asian immigrants for hookworm, and for Filipinos who had been colonized by the United States in the Philippines to be presented as incubators of leprosy. So that this was not so new by the time this was happening, and this is precisely why Jung, Kulkarni, and Ceniza Choy had grave concerns about what was going to happen in 2020, and they were right. The other part of this chapter that I wanted to focus on were the contributions of Asian American healthcare workers during this pandemic, and I integrated the research findings, especially from my first book, Empire of Care, about the history of Filipino nurses in the United States. They comprise the largest group of foreign-trained nurses in the US, and the Philippines distinguishes itself actually in global history for sending Filipino professionally trained nurses to not just the United States, but to parts of Europe, other parts of North America, and Asia. And if you recall, actually, the first nurse to administer a COVID-19 vaccine, which was in the UK, was actually a Filipina British nurse, Mae Parsons. And so the chapter also focuses that this is not a recent phenomenon that we see Filipino nurses on the front lines of disease. But there's actually a longer history that begins in the early 20th century with US colonization of the Philippines and the bringing of Americanized education to the archipelago, including Americanized nursing education that included the study of colloquial as well as formal English, thereby preparing Filipino nurses, even though that was not the initial intent, but preparing Filipino nurses to alleviate critical nursing shortages here in the United States, especially in inner city public hospitals, especially in rural areas after World War II. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many of them were on the front lines because one of their contributions is bedside nursing and elder care. And so they're often on the front lines, and partly as a result of that, the COVID-19 pandemic took a disproportionate toll on the lives of Filipino nurses, tragically. That even though they comprise only 4% of the US national nursing workforce, they were comprising about a third of US nursing deaths. Now, has to do with that contribution of their bedside nursing. So in the top image is of the earlier 20th century and the training of Filipino nurses, often by American nursing supervisors in the Philippines, and wearing the iconic nursing cap and gown. But the bottom image is of the Philippine Nurses Association here in central Minnesota. So in the late 1970s, there was an organization of the Philippine Nurses Association of America, and it consists of over 50 chapters throughout the United States of Filipino nurses. And so the PNA, as it's called, PNA of Central Minnesota, is part of this national organization that is contributing so much to all of our healthcare delivery. 1975 is another chapter, and in this particular chapter, it's titled Trauma and Transformation, and I wanted to read just a few paragraphs from it to give you a sense of how the writing is. 1975 marks a tumultuous year in Asian American history. It was the beginning of many journeys of Vietnamese, Hmong, Laotian, and Cambodian refugees to the United States. At the heart of the refugees' journey is the flight from persecution and violence in order to survive. The 1951 Refugee Convention, a United Nations multilateral treaty, defines a refugee as someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Southeast Asian refugees fled from the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the Cambodian Civil War and genocide, and the Secret War in Laos. They feared or experienced persecution because they had opposed communism and had allied with US-backed forces and governments. In short, they were here because Americans were there. So in addition to the many indelible ways that our participation, the US participation in the Vietnam War, changed the homelands and landscapes of these groups, I also point out in the chapter contributions and the ways that Southeast Asian American refugees and immigrants have also transformed and contributed to our American landscapes, including our economic and our literary landscapes. And so on the left-hand side is an image of Ted Ngoy, who is a Cambodian American refugee, was a military officer in Cambodia and had to flee because he was allied with US forces. And like so many refugees, especially of that first wave, who had direct connection with US forces and who often were highly educated. Even with that, when they came here because of issues of language and training, Ted Ngoy was working a number of different jobs, including working as a janitor. And he was working in Southern California, and he happened one day to taste a donut. And he so enjoyed it. He said that it reminded him of a treat that he used to have in Cambodia. And so he started working for a donut shop, learned how to make donuts, and then became known as the Donut King. He started opening his own shops, owning them, leasing them to other Cambodian American refugee families. And one of his innovations is what he's holding in this particular image, which is the pink box. Today we know of the pink box as that is the visual cue that there's donuts in there, or there's some like sweet treat in there, right? We know that instinctively. But prior to his innovation, most donut shops used white boxes. And he decided to use pink boxes because they were less expensive. And so there was a larger profit margin. So that's one of his contributions. The Donut King is an excellent documentary that came out in 2020. It has been screened on PBS. Some of you may have seen it, but it also streams online, I believe, still through PBS, so please check it out. It's about him and his personal, ups and downs, but it's also about how Cambodian American refugee families have gone into this particular business and what it takes to be in this business. Many of them work 7 days a week, and many of them involve both the employment of parents as well as their children, working these long hours to make these treats, available and accessible to all of us. And then on the right, something that I hope you're familiar with, but a very historic landmark anthology, Bamboo Among the Oaks, which was published by Minnesota Historical Society Press in 2002, edited by Mei-Ning Mua. Really a landmark anthology in terms of being the first of its kind to gather first and second generation Hmong American creative writing. And Mei-Ning Mua was interviewed by the New York Times when this anthology came out. I'm going to paraphrase, even though it's in the book. But she said something that has really struck me, which is that when people don't have a written record of their experience, it's like they don't exist. And so it's so important to have books like this from the perspective of Hmong America. Um, 1968 is another important origin year, and it is referring to the origin of actually the name Asian America. That's a name that has not always been with us and really came out of a student organization at UC Berkeley founded by graduate students. The organization was called the Asian American Political Alliance. And they used their historical agency, which is the ability to make choices, and in doing so, to make history. They observed that prior to this time, the way they were referred to was often in terms of racial slurs. I mean, really dehumanizing terms like quote-unquote gook, or quote-unquote Jap, or quote-unquote chink. Or if they were referred to as a more benign term, the now outdated identity term of Oriental, what they observed was that it kind of commodified them as non-American, or as an object, objectifying them as a kind of rug or vase. And so they chose this term, Asian American, to acknowledge both their Asian heritages and histories, but also the importance of being part of American history and experience. 1968 and 1969 is also the time period of the Third World Liberation Front, these historic student strikes that took place at UC Berkeley. So this is an iconic historic image of my campus, University of California, Berkeley, by Sather Gate, during this very long student strike. But this strike initiated at San Francisco State University, so I also want to give a shout out to them. And it led to, at San Francisco State, the creation of a College of Ethnic Studies and a Department of Asian American Studies. And at Berkeley, we have a Department of Ethnic Studies, which includes a program in Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies. And I use this chapter to, one, talk about how important that name is, Asian American. And that I think it's important that we discuss it, that, you know, names and identities are dynamic and people can make different choices. But I wanted readers to understand that this term has a history and how meaningful that history was to Asian Americans of that time and continuing in the present moment. Personally, it's an identity that continues to be very important to me. But I also wanted to talk about, in this chapter, the importance of the history of solidarity between Asian Americans and other racialized groups, especially Black students from these TWLF strikes, but also Latino and Native American students as well. But I especially wanted to emphasize in this particular chapter a history of Black Asian American solidarity that doesn't begin in 1968, but also has a history that's over 100 years old. And the reason why I was especially moved to do that, again, had to do with during the COVID-19 pandemic and the interviews I was doing with media, either a journalist, because of what the general public was saying, or at times during live interviews, like on radio, a caller would ask me, isn't this surge in anti-Asian violence really about Black on Asian violence in the current day, and not this history that you're talking about of medical racism and medical scapegoating? And I responded that that's not true. That's not true. And this is not to say that there are no tensions between Asian American and Black and other racialized communities. But at the same time, there's also a long history of solidarity between our communities that has also been not as well known. It's a part of that erasure of this kind of solidarity. So I wanted to show this and point out Brian Batuco, who is a high school educator in the San Diego Unified School District. He wrote this blog post, Teaching Black and Asian American Solidarity in the Classroom, in the Beacon Press blog called Beacon Broadside. And so this was published in June of 2023. And he used that section of my book, in this chapter on 1968, about this longer history of Black Asian American solidarity. And he had students read that part, but then also create these posters featuring nuances as well as big ideas that they learned. And so this is a photo that he took of some of the student projects, and I'll show you some of the, you might see it better this way. But I'll start with the far left, which is on the marriage of Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and Cecilia Suyat, who's Filipina-American. Cecilia Suyat's Filipino-American from Hawaii, and she wanted to go to New York to study and learn. And when she went to an employment office, because she was a brown Asian American person, the person said, well, maybe you could work for the NAACP. And so she worked as a legal secretary for the NAACP, and she was actually doing typing and retyping so many of those briefs regarding the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education. So she played this fascinating role. And then she developed this relationship with, at that point, lawyer and widower Thurgood Marshall. And so their work together on the NAACP, and then later on certainly a number of legal cases, is just one example of this kind of solidarity. And then other students chose this example of Takeshi Hoshizaki and the Marshalls from World War II. And Hoshizaki was a child during World War II, but he was one of those 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast from Los Angeles who was interned. And the Marshalls were his and his family's Black neighbors in downtown Los Angeles. And the Marshalls, I share this story based from this oral history interview with Hoshizaki. The Marshalls came like 30 miles, inland to the Los Angeles Fairgrounds, where they had been assembled before being incarcerated in an internment camp. And the Marshalls had a catering business, and it was so dry and hot and dusty, and they brought this apple pie a la mode that they were able to give to Hoshizaki and his other family members. And they were separated by a fence, but they were able to cut, the pie, and because they were caterers, they had this very skillful way of creating a space in the pie so that the ice cream would fit just so and melt, into the pie. And then the final poster featured here on the right is of the great orator Frederick Douglass, who gave this lecture in 1869 on our composite nationality, in which he advocated for diversity and multicultural inclusion in the United States. And he supported Chinese migration and Chinese naturalization to become US citizens. And this was already during a time, 1869, of rising anti-Chinese violence and sentiment that would lead to the passage in 1882 of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Another important origin year is 1965, and it's so important because I was just mentioning the Exclusion Act, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Prior to 1965, when you study immigration history, you'll notice that a major theme is the exclusion and immigration restriction of various groups of Asians to the United States. And so the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, sometimes referred to as the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, was part of civil rights legislation during this time period. And prior to 1965, our national immigration system really favored the immigration of Northern and Western European immigrants, and overtly discriminated not solely against Asian immigrants, but also of Southern and Eastern European immigrants as well. And the 1965 Immigration Act changed that. So it's a very important year for Asian American histories. And it created a much more equitable, what was called a ceilings system of immigration, where there was an equal number of visas that was distributed to countries throughout the world. And as a result of that, the passage of the 1965 Act, we saw this exponential increase in Asian immigration to the United States. And among the largest sending groups were from the Philippines, but also China and India. And so there's a terrific resource that's online. It's called the South Asian American Digital Archive. And it goes by the acronym SADA, and they have a project called the First Days Project. And the idea is that it preserves immigrant stories. And it's not exclusively South Asian immigrant stories, although many of them are, but you can contribute stories from immigrants from around the world and what their first experiences were when they arrived in the United States. And it's such an important project for documenting and preserving and resisting the erasure of Asian immigrant, in this case, Asian immigrant histories. And so this screenshot is a story that one of the stories that I chose from this archive to feature in the book. And it's Lakshmi Kalapatapu, who arrived because of the provisions of the 1965 Act. She arrived from Hyderabad, India in 1974, and she arrived here in Minnesota. And I love her story because she writes about her first days and just marveling at the incredible amount of snowfall here. She arrived in the summer, but she said, well, soon after that, the snow came, and that it continued actually into the following year, like almost till May. And I was thinking, yes, I can relate to that. What I loved about it is, I think for those of us who've grown up here, I'm the daughter of Filipino immigrants, and I was born and raised in New York City. And so I'm familiar with snow. I mean, Minnesota was definitely a new experience for me, Minnesota snow, but I have some familiarity with it. And I think I may have taken it for granted. You know, that awesome quality of snowfall and snow accumulation. And she writes about that. She was following her husband who immigrated before her, and then she came with their two young sons. And she said that she spent so much time by the window with her sons just watching the snowfall. And what a remarkable experience that was. And that too is part of Asian American histories, these everyday or mundane moments of awe and wonder and joy. Okay. I have an interlude in the book called 1965 Reprise, because 1965 is also a very important origin year for thinking about the history of Asian American contributions to food and foodways. And 1965 is important because Filipino American farm workers in Delano, California, led by Larry Itliong, who's pictured here on the left, initiated the famous grape strike that led to the boycott, that led to reaching out to Mexican American farm workers and their leadership of Cesar Chavez, who many of us know his name and his contributions are more well known regarding the formation of the United Farm Workers, or UFW. But Larry Idleong is also such an integral part of that history. It's such an incredible irony that the people who were growing fruits and vegetables to contribute to our own health were living and toiling in some of the most unhealthy conditions. And one of their achievements in forming the UFW and participating in that strike was the Agricultural Labor Relations Act that was passed in 1975 that allowed California farm workers to legally organize and to be recognized collectively by the owners. And so I use that as a touchstone to talk about the past as well as the present contributions to Asian American contributions to food and foodways in the United States. And so on the right-hand side, there's an image, and it's of these lunch bags that were decorated by volunteers for a nonprofit organization called Heart of Dinner. Heart of Dinner was founded by two Asian American women, restaurateurs, and people in the food business in New York City during the COVID-19 pandemic, because our Asian American elders were being targeted during the surge in anti-Asian violence and were especially vulnerable. They created Heart of Dinner to organize volunteers to deliver Asian-style lunches and meals to our elders in the city. And they had volunteers also decorate the bags with uplifting words, often in their first Asian languages. So Heart of Dinner, they still exist. Please check them out online. Dr. Jacob Roram mentioned my second book, Global Families, A History of Asian International Adoption in America. And I really owe that book to my students here at the University of Minnesota. So many of them, of whom were Asian American adoptees, and especially Korean adoptees who have come of age and who were in my Asian American Studies classes. And they would ask me, like, well, where and when do Asian adoptees enter in Asian American histories? And at that point in time, which was like the late 1990s, there wasn't as much scholarship as we have now on Asian American adoption studies. And so Asian American studies, ethnic studies, it's about being relevant and accessible to the communities in which we live and serve. And I recognized from my teaching experience that how important and integral Asian adoptees are to Asian America. So on the left is more of a historic photograph of two Asian American adoptees who are mixed race and who were adopted by a white American family in upstate New York. And so this chapter, the origin year is 1953, the end of the Korean War. Korea distinguishes itself in world history as the leading sending country of, historically, of adoptive children internationally. And the pioneers of this phenomenon, the vast majority of them were adopted by families here in the United States, but there are also significant international Asian adoptive families in specific European countries. The pioneers were mixed race, children who were born of Korean women and predominantly white and black US servicemen. And I owe a debt also to University of Minnesota Libraries, the special collections, and specifically the Social Welfare History Archives, which has the archive of the International Social Service USA branch which did so much work after World War II on this phenomenon of Asian international adoption in the US. On the right is Deanne Lim-Bourche, who's a Korean adoptee whose adoption was facilitated by ISS USA. She's not mixed race. As time went on, the majority of Korean adoptees were, in quotes, what's sometimes called like full-blooded Korean adoptive children who were born especially of single Korean mothers. But I wanted to include this image because she's an accomplished filmmaker. First Person Plural is one of her most important documentaries regarding her experience of international adoption. But I wanted to include this because Asian adoptees and other adoptees are often stereotyped as forever children. And similar to those adoptees who taught me so much in my classes, they grow up, they are adults, and a number of them are now scholars and artists who are documenting and preserving their experiences, and we need to pay attention to those experiences on their own terms and in their voices. I want to be mindful here of time. I think I'm running over just a little bit, so I'm going to move more quickly. 1941 and 1942, referring to both this chapter is actually called The Days That You Remember, the dropping of the surprise attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor, December 7th in 41, but also February 19th, 1942, and FDR's executive order that led to the incarceration of so many Japanese Americans on the West Coast without due process, as I've mentioned before. On the left is one of Dorothea Lange's photographs based in Oakland. This is a business that's owned by a University of California graduate, and just putting out a sign, "I am an American," because there was so many different kinds of violence during this time against Japanese Americans in the streets, and even people who were not necessarily Japanese American, but looked Japanese American. So beatings, vandalism, but vandalism against businesses, and hence this point, "I am an American," in such incredibly big font and print. But on the right-hand side, I did want to point out John Okada. Certainly one of the contributions of Japanese Americans during this time period, in addition to serving, for example, in the US military in things like the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and sacrificing, many of them sacrificing their lives for the United States. There were also thousands of Japanese Americans who participated as translators. And so Jacob had mentioned the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage and Fort Snelling, but John Okada was one of those translators who trained at Fort Snelling here in Minnesota. And then he wrote this very important book, No No Boy, about those Japanese American men who resisted, who resisted declaring their loyalty, and how they interpreted also as their form of patriotism. So how complex this time period was, but again, how important Minnesota is to these histories. Another origin year is 1919. This has to do with the 1919 Korean Congress in Philadelphia. Beginning in 1910, Japan colonized Korea, and those Korean immigrant pioneers who were primarily in Hawaii and in California, a number of them were independence activists for a free Korea, and they gathered in Philadelphia in 1919 to try to gain the support from our Congress in the hopes of liberty and democracy. And this was in response to their major independence movement in Korea, the March 1st movement in 1919, when over 1 million Koreans demonstrated primarily in Seoul and were met with very overt violence by the Japanese regime. One of those independence activists, Korean independence activists, a pioneer who never was able to return, was my husband's grandfather. And so on the right is a picture of my family, including myself. In the early 2000s, the South Korean government acknowledged and recognized some of these activists as Korean patriots, and they reinterred his grandfather's remains in the Daejeon National Cemetery in Daejeon, South Korea, and so we were able to visit and see it. The final two, 1875 is referring to the passage of the Page Act, which I'll be really brief, is a piece it's a piece of immigration restriction. But it's also about a long history of the commodification and sexual objectification of Asian and Asian American women. Because that act was about prohibiting the migration of people, women specifically, of immoral purposes, immoral women. But when the Page Act was enforced, it's a US law, but when it was enforced, it was only enforced in China and Japan and other Asian ports. And I connected this to another tragedy in 2021, in March, the Atlanta spa shootings. And here I told the story in that chapter of the work of Amanda Phing Bodipakya, who's the daughter of Thai and Indonesian immigrants, and who's from Atlanta. And she's a neuroscientist by training, has done work on Alzheimer's, but she's also a visual artist and a STEM educator. And she did a number of public projects, including this one that I'm featuring here, How We Belong Here, We Are More, and We Too Are America. And she did this also in response, in dialogue to what was happening during COVID-19, but also the Atlanta spa shootings. And I love what she says about this theme of erasure, and specifically resistance to erasure, which is that so much of her work in neuroscience and in this kind of art is about making visible the invisible. And I'm going to end with the conclusion of 1869 and Corky Lee. Corky Lee, sometimes known as like the father of Asian American photojournalism, was one of the over 1 million American lives lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wanted to pay tribute here in the conclusion to erasure, violence, erasure, and resistance. In 1869 is referring to the origin year of the formation of the joining of the first transcontinental railroad in the United States, which was a momentous occasion regarding the rise of the United States as a major world power. And that railroad would not have been built had it not been for the over 90% like Chinese railroad labor workforce working on the western part of the railroad. And when they finally met at Promontory Summit in Utah for the iconic celebratory photograph, the Chinese were not included in the photograph. So it's a form of erasure. And Corky Lee learned about this, and he was reflecting on it, and he called that absence, that erasure, a wound. You know, this kind of violence, some of which is very physical or literal, but then is also like a kind of psychic or, you know, psychological and moral violence as well. And so he used his talents to restage that iconic photograph in the 145th anniversary of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And they recreated at the exact point the same pose, but this time he included the descendants of those Chinese railroad laborers and others, and they're wearing very vibrant colors, and if you're able to look up close, you can see that they're smiling and full of joy. And Corky Lee referred to this example as an example of photographic justice. So I just want to thank all of you for being here. It means so much to see you and be with you in person. Again, I want to shout out to Dr. Jacob Roram, Jane and Evan, everyone at the Minnesota Historical Society History Forum, the organizers and sponsors. Please keep learning about these histories. I know I'm speaking to an audience of perpetual learners, so I feel like you're my people, and that please keep learning about these histories. Take a course or create an Asian American history book club, and document, preserve, and create Asian American histories by telling your own story or your community's story. Thank you so much.
So we do have some time for some questions for Dr. Choy. So if you do have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a wireless mic so that we can hear you and also our virtual audience can hear you. So our volunteer Samantha will be on this aisle. I'll take this aisle. So.
Well, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. But you didn't mention that the Minnesota Historical Theater has a play right now called Secret Warriors, and it's excellent. It's really well done. It has an emotional punch as well as a historical facts. So I encourage everybody who hasn't gone there to do it. It goes until the end of next week.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I would have loved to have seen it. I'm so sorry to miss it, but thank you for sharing that.
I have a million questions, but just an observation. As a tutor in the public schools, I noticed both the myth and the expectation that somehow or other Asian students by nature are going to be superior, and yet they have such a wide range of interests and abilities and behaviors. And so I'm wondering if you have any comments about expectations and the reality of developing a fully formed human being who can be expressive and participate in society that they're living in now.
Yeah, I appreciate your question so much. I mean, I had mentioned earlier how popular and pervasive and pernicious the myth of the model minority continues to be for our Asian American communities, and especially for our students. And I believe it's that kind of stereotype, or what Patricia Hill Collins would call a controlling image, where you're not looking, I'm not saying you, but some people aren't looking at Asian Americans as human beings, or Asian American, especially our young students, as individuals, but rather as this very one-dimensional group that is somehow naturally smart and obedient, and especially in the STEM fields. And there's a history to that. I mean, a number of Asian American historians have pointed that there's actually a long history that goes throughout the 20th century, but many of us will refer to the 1960s and how specifically that myth of Asian Americans as a model minority became popular in mainstream media, especially in relation to Black Americans. That this is a model minority that doesn't complain, they don't make waves, in contrast. So it's very pernicious and divisive in that sense. And then getting to the point with the students, I mean, there was actually a Time magazine cover that had a group of Asian American students on the cover, and it said "Whiz Kids" on the cover. So these kinds of images aren't just coming from anywhere. They're very pervasive, and I think as community members and as educators, we should understand that history of stereotyping. We have to understand why it's a myth for all the reasons that you've already, articulated so well. That no, not every Asian American is like naturally talented in STEM, and I'm one example of of that. It really might seem positive, but it's very detrimental, incredibly detrimental. So thank you for letting me at least address that a little bit.
Thank you for coming today. And I just, without getting too political, I would just like to know if, in the context of your Asian American Studies work at your school and the current administration's DEI efforts, is there any threat that you feel to the work that you do and the department that you are a part of at your school? And just to piggyback on the last presenter that we had in this history forum, she was talking about erasure of the LGBTQ aspect of our national parks in the context of the current administration and how they were erasing really a lot of history. So again, not trying to get too political, but just understanding how the current administration's DEI efforts tie in or give you concern about your work in Asian American Studies. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. Absolutely, there's a connection between what is going on regarding, I'm not quite sure what the right word to use, but the stigmatization of any work related to DEI as not as being part of a negative woke ideology, as as one example, or not being a priority, of our current administration. It's very much a concern, not only on my individual mind, and not only solely as an Asian American Studies and Ethnic Studies scholar, but also as a historian. As a whole, and so I appreciate you bringing in the previous speaker. I mean, this is a criticism, also a very critical take on the history profession, trained historians, the progress that we've made in trying to create a more accurate and truthful history and histories of the United States. So we see that erasure not solely with LGBTQ plus histories, but also with African American and Asian American histories and others as well. And so you'll see things being taken out regarding the forced incarceration, let's say, of Japanese Americans during World War II. There's some acknowledgement of that, but trying to take the more critical aspects, of that history and frame it in a different way. And my sense of this conversation with, if we want to think of it that way, to be more diplomatic about it, but if I were in a conversation with the current administration, I would say that it's precisely in that encounter regarding the difficult parts of our history that we can recognize progress and that we can achieve greatness. So it feels very much like a direct criticism of, but not solely the work that I do, but so many of us, and it's not just DEI and ethnic studies, but it's history as well. So I hope I responded in a way. If did I miss anything that you wanted me to address?
Also, does your work at your school, do you feel threatened? A lot of schools have had to conform to what the administration wants. Is there any concern that your ethnic studies?
There's definitely a concern, and there's definitely a concern for our department, but there's also a concern for our campus as a whole. I mean, it's no secret that, I mean, we're part of a list of universities that are being scrutinized by our current government. Our chancellor, Richard Lyons, has spoken out about how we intend to work within the law and still uphold our community principles. And I, every day, I'm very intentional of being strong, to show up to work every day and be strong for my colleagues and my students as well as myself during these challenging times.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you for the talk. Especially thank you for bringing Corky Lee and the photograph of the Chinese descendants of the Chinese railroad workers into your talk and bringing that into the room. And related to that, and talking about erasure, I've kind of noticed that there's a progressive anti-racist version of Asian American erasure where an example would be there's a lot of murals uplifting different communities, Black, Latinx, Native, LGBTQ+, women, people with disabilities, and they'll leave out Asian people, right? In a lot of conversations about race and equity, people will say Black, Native, and Latinx, and they will intentionally leave out Asian people. What I'm kind of getting at is in the progressive and anti-racist communities, there's kind of this erasure of the Asian American experience with this assumption that we're closest in proximity to whiteness. We're basically white people anyway. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that in terms of an intervention, because it strikes me that that type of conceit is really getting in the way of true solidarity between all of our communities. But it's, in my experience, if you are an Asian American progressive who pushes back against that, you're seen as not really an anti-racist, you're not really down for the cause, you know?
Yeah, there's a little bit of glare, but Bao, is that you? Yeah, so good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. It's hard for me, even with my glasses. There's this light coming, so it's so good to see you. Thanks so much for that that nuanced question. I do think that's one of the unique challenges about Asian America and its histories and the coalitional work. I think my intervention in the book, I mean, I believe that this book is very much an intervention to exactly what you're saying in such an articulate, thoughtful way. But I think especially in that chapter on 1968, where I give this alternative historical timeline to Black and Asian American history, and to reveal this much longer history of Black Asian American solidarity, is kind of my most, I think, direct intervention. And I think all of us just need to continue. I think the long term, you know, for me, like the long term end game is about the educational piece to it. But ethnic studies and Asian American studies were still like advocating for its teaching, you know, K through 12 and throughout higher education. So we need to keep calling that out, what you're saying, to just present another way of looking at Asian America, not as model minorities or honorary whites or perpetual foreigners, but also an integral part of this multiracial progressive activism, you know, a longer history of activism. So I think that's a big response, but I hear you, and that's what I've been trying to do, just in terms of my writing and speaking as much as possible. And I know you are too, actually.
Thank you very much for delivering this talk. I have two children who I call post-typewriter era. They don't know how to use a typewriter, especially a manual typewriter. And so they came of age, they started really observing things after 9/11. And so they come from a totally different era. And I know from their own words, and I think it's widespread across the United States, of people their age, no matter what background, ethnicity, they just think, they expect less in their future than previous generations did. I wonder if you have thoughts about that with respect to Asian Americans, but also in general.
Yeah, I think if I understand you, that younger generations, this post-typewriter generations have, it's a bit of a tragedy in a sense. That's the tone I get, that the future is less bright. Okay, I hope I'm understanding that. And especially for our Asian American young people. And you know, I think about this a lot in the context of my work as a professor and as and as a teacher. You know, among the most vulnerable communities, given the various executive orders that have been out, include our undocumented communities, our international student communities, our LGBTQ plus communities. And all of these communities intersect with Asian America. Sometimes there's this popular perception of the undocumented, I'll just talk about the undocumented community, as being a community that's really about the US-Mexico border, and so much of the discourse is about building a wall there and enforcement. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that this is also an integral part of Asian American communities, the undocumented community. And so there are multiple levels of vulnerability and precarity that we are bearing witness to and trying to respond to at this point in time. And Asian America is included in all of those communities. And so there's a lot at stake here for Asian America. And I can understand what might be some pessimism, but what I've learned from other activists, and including my own students, I mean, one of the best things that we can do is to be active and to be creative and to use our talents to shape the world that we want to live in. And I think that's very empowering. And that's the message that I try to get across in my writing and in my pedagogy. Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful place to, and I know there's more questions. We could be here a long time, but Dr. Choy will be up in the rotunda signing copies of her book, and would love to invite you to talk to her there. And thank you so much also for your support of History Forum this season. I know many of you are dedicated attendees, and have been supporting. I know many of you are members. Thank you for your membership of MNHS. I do want to give you a heads up. Next season, our plan is to shift the timing of it so it aligns with 2026, because 2026 is the 250th of the United States, the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to be doing a series that's investigating and revisiting the American Revolution in hopefully new ways that we're not used to, and some of the new scholarship that's come out around there, and the really diverse ways to think about that era and what it means for us now. So if you're looking for History Forum announcement for the fall, you might have to wait a couple more months. So I'm working on it now, but thank you again so much for your support of this series, for your support of MNHS, and for joining Dr. Choy for this really delightful talk. Please join her up in the rotunda to talk more.
Thank you.